Hey everybody, I see you've stuck with it to find out what's going on in week 2 in the class. So in this video, I really want to just provide a general overview of what we're talking about in this course, framed around the idea that we address in the readings for this week about the foundations of institutional research and assessment work in post-secondary education. So when I think about the foundations of IR and assessment and what this course is all about, I wanted to hit a couple of points about what is it that we're doing this semester. Now, hopefully you've scrolled through Canvas and you've seen the topics for each, and the titles for each week and each module, but want to kind of try to boil those down to some highlights and kind of get away from just headings and really think about what is it that we're really talking about. And as I said in the introduction video for week 1, want to make sure that you're leaving the class with a set of skills, and one of those skills is about being conversant in this practice of assessment work. Whether we label it of institutional research or program evaluation or learning outcomes assessment, whatever it is, I think it all falls underneath an umbrella of assessment. And maybe we should even refine that a little bit further and call the umbrella inquiry. And this is something that I'll touch on here and there throughout the semester. But if we think about this work as inquiry, then our focus is on learning. It's not just about collecting information to put in reports to satisfy some stakeholder somewhere. But if we think about the work of assessment and institutional research as inquiry, then our focus is on learning. We're learning about what we do well. We learn about what we need to improve. We learn about our students' experiences. We learn about what our students either do or do not learn during their time with us. So to kind of shift back to where I was originally starting, we're talking about how do we answer calls for accountability. And that's a big part. As you read the piece from Volkheim, you see kind of some of the history of institutional research really came out of external pressures from the government, external pressures from granting agencies, external pressures from various funding sources. And so that's a big part of what drives assessment practice at colleges and universities and other institutions that fall under the umbrella of post-secondary ed. That it's about answering questions from outside. But we have to remember that we're also accountable to students that we serve. We're accountable to parents. We're accountable to families. We're accountable to the employees of each institution as well. Because if we're not doing what we said we're going to do, and the only way to know that is to document that through some rigorous approaches to data collection and analysis, then we really have no means for being able to keep the doors open. As we see institutions close their doors, generally, I mean, obviously it's because of financial issues. They have declining enrollments and rising costs. But in some cases, I've seen some institutions that kind of started sliding down this slope of declining enrollments and did not take seriously the importance of approaching assessment in some very serious ways. When institutions face crisis, sometimes what happens is they choose to collect the data and provide evidence at a kind of a bare minimum. What is the least that's requested? And that's really often how folks approach accreditation. It becomes challenging because we have multiple layers of accreditation. Let's look at Murray State University as an example. We have our regional accrediting body, which is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. Multiple colleges on our campus have accrediting agencies at the collegiate level. So in the College of Education and Human Services, we have a national accrediting board for teacher preparation programs. We have a state level board accrediting agency for teacher preparation programs. There's a national accrediting agency for counselor education. There's one for social work. And so we see that the assessment process and the rigors in terms of the amount of work required is extensive. There's always somebody asking for more. And the cycle really never ends in terms of when someone is up and due for an accreditation visit and providing the next level of report. And so it's easy to see how an institution or a unit within an institution kind of just approaches it in terms of what do we need to collect, what do we need to produce, what do we need to provide. But then when we look at the administrative side and largely the student affairs side, student affairs functions are not accredited. Now we are part of overall institutional accreditation. If you look at section 3, I believe it is, of the SACS accreditation expectations, there are aspects to the out-of-class experiences of students that folks in student affairs have to document and participate in. But largely, what we do in our field is not subject to accreditation. Nobody's going to come in and do a visit that's focused solely on Greek life. No one's going to do a visit focused solely on admissions. We might have some external reviewers come in and look at our procedures and processes, but it's different. So we need to make sure that we're able to connect the work that we do to student learning and connect the work that we do to student retention or persistence. And because we don't have those direct calls for external validation or accreditation. And so all these things are interconnected. Now, obviously, we have to connect those dots for people to student learning and student persistence. And it's easier in some areas than others. But so that's one of the things we're going to address later this semester, or really in, I think, about 4 weeks, when we talk about learning outcomes and how do we write those. So we'll look at learning outcomes that are strictly looking at the student experience. We're also going to talk about learning outcomes that are really not learning outcomes, they're organizational outcomes, and how do we measure and assess those? How do we evaluate those? And so it's a similar process for both. And so I think that'll be useful as a skill as you come out of this course, is to not only be conversant in learning outcomes, but be able to write them and be able to explain what type of data would need to be collected to evaluate them, and what type of analysis would need to be conducted with that data. And so I think that as I've kind of talked around and through the first 3 dots there, I think I've kind of alluded to the fact that this enterprise of assessment and institutional research has a political realm to it, that there's a lot of interplay of different moving parts, and there's a lot of pressure on folks who engage in this work. Not that there isn't pressure on folks who engage in any type of work in post-secondary education, but we'll spend time talking about politics of assessment. And one of the other big things, and there's a single week devoted to it on the syllabus, but one of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the term is the fact that we compare ourselves to other institutions. At Murray State, we have a defined group of peer institutions from around the country. I believe there are 19 other institutions on that list besides Murray State University. And we use that as our group for making those comparisons for a process that's often referred to as benchmarking. Using common metrics, we look to see how are we doing compared to our peers. Now, in the Commonwealth, we sometimes get caught up in trying to compare the work that we do at Murray State to the work that folks are doing over in Lexington at the University of Kentucky or up in Louisville at the University of Louisville. And those are different institutional types. They do not have the same type of mission that we do as an institution. They have a different campus size, different campus structure, different campus setting. And so we need to make sure that we're making as close to apple and apple, maybe it's apple to crab apple sometime, but we want those comparisons to be as uniform as possible. So we'll talk through those this semester. So I like to have a little humor sometimes. Sometimes I don't think assessment is dry, but students have told me over the years that talking about assessment can get a little dry. So I'd like to inject a little humor here and there. And I just love this comic from Dilbert that I've given students the warning that be wary of information that you see, because sometimes we treat numbers as though numbers cannot be messed with. Numbers are simply what they are. The reality is that there are people who are very adept at working with numbers, and some might say manipulating numbers, and usually we think of manipulation as a bad thing. But that's what you're doing in the practice with the practice of statistics. You're manipulating numbers to try to see how do different data points interact with each other in meaningful ways. Now, hopefully, we don't encounter folks who are kind of going to this point of Dilbert who don't have any accurate numbers, so they just make one up, and then when questioned about it, then make up another one. But I think that's funny. So one of the things I want you to think about as we go through this term, particularly as we start the term, is thinking about what assessment means to you. If we were face to face, I would probably ask you to say the first thing that comes to mind when you hear assessment, and somebody would probably simply respond with assessment, and that's okay. But think about what is assessment, and you can see in this Wordle that somebody else put together that assessment can reflect a number of different perspectives. That sometimes assessment is about determining quality, that sometimes people think of assessment as purely about what other stakeholders are requesting. Some people understand the importance of assessment in the planning process. And so it's important to think about that as we start the term. What comes to mind? What does assessment mean to you? And I generally fall, and I talked about inquiry, and I've used the term institutional research. For the most part, you'll hear me and see me reference assessment as the overarching concept that we're talking about this semester. Because this is the language that's used in the field, and because one of my goals is that one of your skills is to be conversant in this practice that is really sought after within our field right now. So that's kind of one of my other goals for you coming out of this class, is not to be conversant just so that you are. It's so that when you're interviewing for jobs, whether it's your first professional job or promotion or the next professional step, and you're able to talk about the importance of assessment in meaningful ways, that can be very powerful. I had former students from Louisiana State who had that exact experience in interviews and got multiple job offers. I'm not saying it happens for everyone, but I did have it happen. In fact, I had a student who took the class when I offered it the first time in 2009, was able to talk about assessment with our new vice president at the institution, and next thing you know, she had an assessment position created for her at LSU. So this is a highly sought after skill, particularly among new and younger professionals, newish professionals, because more and more people understand just how critical it is. Again, kind of going back to those bullet points, connecting the work of student affairs and higher ed admin positions to student learning and retention and persistence. And so that's really why we assess. It's about making those connections. It's about demonstrating the importance of the work in this field. But also, again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier in the video, that if we can think about the work of assessment as inquiry, that's why we assess. We need to be focused on learning about why our work is important, and that importance has to be framed around the student experience and those student outcomes for the institution. So some other distinctions that we see, and you'll see this in a couple of different readings this semester, the distinctions between assessment, evaluation, and research. And these are somewhat contrived. Some people use these terms interchangeably. The author who put this particular verbiage together sees them as very distinct things, where research is really about discovery and developing models, testing theories. Research is kind of more, we think about it in terms of the work that academics do. So my work largely when I'm writing or engaging in scholarship is about research. It's about discovery. It's about thinking differently or applying new approaches to old concepts. That's part of discovery. Assessment is about collecting and analyzing data that help us either identify or describe phenomena. And so it's, yeah, how do students see connections, or what are the connections that students see between their student leadership program and their career aspirations? Well, that's very much an identify and describe type of thing. Evaluation is about using that data, using those results of those findings from those assessment efforts to guide decision making and improve institutional practices. And so as we talk about assessment throughout the semester, we're probably going to talk about all three of these things as being intertwined, which is one of the reasons that often as people talk about assessment at conferences, or some folks write about assessment, we see these concepts overlapping. And this is especially true when we use inquiry as our umbrella concept, because inquiry is about discovery. It's about collecting information and data and analyzing it. And it's about improvement. And so it is an intertwining and an overlap. So I've mentioned this already, that assessment, I've used the term rigorous already. Assessment is systematic. We have systems in place and we have a process in place to follow. And assessment has to be collaborative. A single person cannot do assessment. It's not just, let's say that there's one person assigned to do the assessment for a division of student affairs. That person can't be the end-all be-all of assessment practice for that division. It has to be collaborative across departments, and there has to be collaboration within each individual department. And so there's a cyclical nature and a systematic nature to assessment. And so I'm going to have this image separately by itself on Canvas. Don't know if it's helpful or not, but I like to share it. I think it's important to have that visual reminder throughout the term that there is this cycle. That again, assessment isn't, I haven't said it yet, it's I thought about it a few minutes ago before starting this video, that assessment is an ongoing process. It's an overarching thing. It's not simply a series of disconnected efforts. So I don't want to read the slides to you. I will post this PowerPoint separately from the video so you can go through these, take notes on them. I think I said that I would do that in the intro video. But we have to start with what we're doing. We have to understand why we're doing something. What is the purpose of the thing being that we're evaluating? What are the desired outcomes? So this is where we make that connection to learning outcomes or performance outcomes for a department. How are we going to evaluate what it is that we're measuring or that it is that we're assessing? How are we going to know what data to collect? So we have to make a lot of decisions about what questions we're hoping to answer through our assessment plan, what are the specific data points that we need, and then how are we going to measure them? And then we have to go out and do it. We have to collect data, we have to analyze data. And yes, there are people who think that this is the only part of assessment that they have to do. As long as they've collected their data and they can show that they've done that, they feel satisfied. Well, unfortunately, this is only one part of the assessment process. So we have to do some analysis. We have to dig in and make interpretations from data that we collect. And then we have to share those results, even if they're not outstanding. We have a responsibility and it's an ethical responsibility to share our findings. Now, we don't have to lay all of our cards out on the table, but there is an ethical concern of making sure that we're actually reporting on what we find. And then following those efforts of analysis and figuring out the results, we have to make decisions. We have to use the outcomes, the outputs of our assessment efforts. If we don't, we are doing a great disservice to the people that we serve. And consider that for almost every case in assessment practice, we're collecting data from people. So if we collect data from people, we have an obligation, I think it's an ethical obligation, to do something with that information. And that do something is making decisions, use it for future planning, and improve the work that we're doing. And then the next step is to engage in the process again and again and again. This should be ongoing. It's not a step 1 through 7 and then repeat. These processes intermingle, they overlap, projects overlap with each other. But if this is approached as one overarching philosophy of assessment practice, then it's not a series of disjointed projects. But we have some challenges. So I said that we don't need to let a single person feel like they're the only one doing assessment. That means we need to build a culture of evidence and a culture of assessment within each department and within each division of student affairs, within each division of academic affairs, whatever the administrative unit or umbrella that we're under. I mentioned a couple of ethical concerns. We need to be aware of those and mindful of those as we do this work. We have to get access to the data that we need. And so as we go through the semester, I'll share some advice that I've learned. Some of it has been kind of hard lessons and hard knocks that I've taken when I've engaged in assessment work over the years. Again, we have to gather evidence from peer institutions. Not everything is going to be readily available on an institution's website or some sort of database. Sometimes we have to actually talk to people and request information, and sometimes we don't get it. We have to manage expectations. Some people think that assessment is going to be some sort of magic cure-all, or maybe even just a penicillin that's going to cure all of our woes at the institution. That once we've got data, we'll be able to do amazing things with it. That's not always the case. Sometimes we have data that reveals some ugly truths for us. And so we have to spend time managing expectations about what we can and can't do from our assessment efforts. And ultimately, we have to evaluate our assessment efforts. And so that's going to, when we wrap up the semester, our last module is about assessing assessment. I think that might be even the title that I used on Canvas. And so we have to look very closely. What did we do over the past year or whatever time span that we're looking at based on our assessment plan? What worked well, what didn't? Are we assessing the right things? Are we using the right instruments? there are a lot of big questions to explore, so it almost becomes its own separate assessment process. So I kind of alluded to this, that assessment is not the same as assessments. And this point is addressed in the Keeling and Associates reading, that assessment is a process that it should be all-encompassing. It requires careful planning, and again, it's an ongoing process. I hear people in higher ed and post-secondary institutions talk about doing assessments in their department throughout the year. These people are approaching assessment in piecemeal ways with separate projects that are disconnected and probably get data that they either can't or don't do much with. And so in week 3, we're going to look at building a culture of assessment. I'm trying to set up, work with a couple people's schedules to do the podcast thing that I talked about in the intro video. And so hopefully the first podcast will be online for week 3 as we talk about building a culture of assessment.